final determination of the human being, and the human being's original vocation, as he describes in his essay, What is Enlightenment, lies precisely in progress. And whoever cannot contribute to this process cannot and ought not participate in the project of enlightenment. So Black people, according to Kant, are not able to fulfill any of these requirements. It is incomprehensible, or more precisely, it's unacceptable or even offensive for Kant. And let us, for the sake of the argument, imagine in accordance with Kant that this is the course, that there might be people who have finished their development and merely enjoy themselves, or who do not agree that they have to make themselves, in a Kantian sense, worthy of humanity. In the writings of the great Enlightenment thinker Kant, we cannot find any attempt to comprehend the other as the other. The other is always a despicable non-one. It is always to be looked and frowned upon as the one who's not like me, the one with whom something is wrong, the one that is not right. So this is the definitions of the par excellence of the other, the non-oneness. Every other characteristic is secondary. The other human being is not needed, and the further development of humanity will in fact show that, according to Kant. Everything not white is superfluous in such a deep sense that in the moment when there's nothing else but whiteness, nothing is missing. The superior human race and the human race will become synonymous in this obscene white supremacist fantasy. And this is the future as envisioned by this brightest shining light of the European Enlightenment. Kant envisions a radically de-other, de-subhumanized, de-non-whitened humanity led by nature to eventually arrive at what he calls the unity of happiness and morality. Kant cannot and will not comprehend the other human beings as beings of value, as valuable in and of themselves. He only understands them as inferior compared to those like himself. These thoughts about the human being and humanity tell us nothing about the other, but they speak volumes about Kant and the self-understanding of the inventor of modern critical philosophy. So let us move from here to the third part after the normative interpretation of difference, the third part of the cycle of superiorism, the deduction of the entitlement of domination. Finding oneself superior means, in practical terms, to find oneself entitled, if not necessitated, to dominate the inferior other. Often enough, the superior one seems to be unable to leave the inferior other alone. The existence of the inferior other seems to urge the superior one to react to the outrageous fact of inferiority. We have already heard that Kant considers certain people to only be able to serve as slaves. But what a strange conclusion is that? Could the indigenous people of America and the Black people of Africa not simply be left alone? Why do they have to serve as slaves? Where does this thus in German also, which Kant uses in his sentence, even come from? How is this thus motivated here? How can these two sentences even be connected like this? It seems impossible for Kant to think of these peoples as perhaps strange, perhaps incomprehensible occurrence of inferior otherness. This is not an oddity that the superior one looks at and finds it to be worthless and just leaves it alone and live its inferior life. Apparently, this is not at all something that the superhuman, like Kant understood himself to be, could do. Fanon wrote, the white man, quote, wants the world. He wants it for himself. He discovers he is the predestined master of the world. He enslaves it. His relationship with the world is one of appropriation, quote. And unfortunately, I have to agree with that. We have to understand the line of thought has shifted here. Something has happened that even goes beyond the coincidence of observation and normative interpretation. There's now suddenly an immediate practical consequence of the normative difference. Again, we can only artificially separate this consequence from its antecedences. We have seen that observation, normative interpretation, and practical consequences are forced to coincide in the strangest unit. And this unit continues to receive its validity from the pseudo-empirical pseudo-self-evidence. Apparently, the superiority of the one cannot rest in the glory of its superiority. It has to become practical and to be applied. Superiorist ontology has to become superiorist ethics. We learn that the normative difference is perceived as an entitlement, if not as an imperative to engage in a certain derisive practice. In the cases we have discussed, this is the practice of submission, of slavery. If someone is not like someone, if someone is not how someone should be to be of value, that is, not being the inferior one, but being the superior one, then the self-declared superior human beings find themselves to be entitled to force the other human being to reduce their otherness as much as possible, to not disturb the superior human beings being superior, to be at least somewhat useful for the superior human being, for instance, by becoming their slaves. The black human being needs the education by the white human being. The white human being has to teach the black human being, a common ideal in colonial literature, to be as least black as possible, but of course never to the point of whiteness. Because racist superiorism is often to be found in the gesture which demands become like us, which adds at the same time, well, you can never become like us because you're not one of us. So the normative difference has created a world of those superior and those inferior. And the superior ones are entitled to force the inferior others to do whatever the superhumans decide. We have claimed that the allegedly inferior other is the creation, the phantasma of the allegedly superior one. However, as soon as the superior transforms the alleged superiority into a practical reality, a factual dominating force becomes reality, and the inferior become something to factually dominate. And from here, we move into the last part of the cycle of superiorism, practice and reinforcement. Every practice of domination, be it one of brutal violence or one of tacit aggression, will reinforce the understanding of the superior one as the superior one and the inferior one as the inferior other. From the observation of inferiority, which is, as we have established, actually a posited arbitrary inferiority, a righteous entitlement was inferred to not only continue to remain in the pseudo-natural state of superiority, but to actively dominate those who and or that which is inferior, and thus to practically create and reinforce the superiority of the one and, mutatis mutandis, the inferiority of the other. The reinforcing practices of domination will lead again to the observation of difference, and the other is, even though the other was an arbitrary creatio ex nihilo in the beginning, now an established entity in the ontology of the allegedly superior. So the cycle of superiorism can and will begin anew, although, as we have to add, the circle is now more predetermined to reproduce its initial assumption. So we have to come back to the initial difference again. There's something that all the observed differences share. The actual relevant difference is not the one between the one and the other culture, not between the one and the other skin color. It seems that the only actually relevant question is the other dominatable by the one or not? And that's the moment when superiority becomes substantiated, the moment in which the one can identify the opportunity to exert violence over the other. Being able to violently rule, to own the other, to enforce one's power over the other, to tell the other where to go, to determine what development means. All this violence is at the heart of superiorism. Superiorism means domination, and the invention of inferiority means to make the possibility of dominatability a reality. The superiorist is not bothered with the form of culture or the depth of knowledge or the importance of a thought of the other human being. Superiorism is about the ability and the practical will to put your boot onto the face of the other, literally or by the power of faulty thinking. The one might have desires and rights, and the other might have them too. But if the one is able and willing to practice to subjugate the other, and the history of Western thought has a clear and deeply irritating tendency to consider these very acts of epistemological and physical violence to be of highest value. There is, however, no excuse for this violence. There is no necessity for this violence. Its origin stems only from the self-aggrandizing narcissistic mania of the pseudo-superhuman. So this violence is willed into existence by the superhuman. This is not something anyone is forced to do. This is not the one who is able to dominate, the one who is able to colonize is indeed able to do so, but by no means forced to do so. So this is what superhuman studies will intend to show. Human beings are not necessitated by anything to become superiorists. Nothing forces human beings to consider themselves as superhuman. Superhumanism is a choice. Its immediate consequence, subhumanism, is not. Superhumanism is willed into existence by the superiorist for nothing else but the superiorist's sake. Superiorism indeed cares only about superiorism. It is a restless and compulsive form of excessive self-care. The superiors just wants more and more and more of themselves and for themselves, and since the superiors cannot bear to be inconvenienced by a guilty conscience, they need to find a way to tell their very own story, as if this story was not a story of radical self-centeredness. And we can now understand superiorism a bit more precisely. It is the conviction of one's own normative superiority as an observable fact that entitles to dominate and to suppress those who are not like oneself. The created others are not embraced by the moral standards of the non-others. The others can be treated without producing a contradiction using divergent moral rules. Superiorism is thus the inability, the unwillingness to accept the other, to incorporate the other into reality, to take the other seriously. And this is where we need to go on and to try to understand what could be the trajectory of superaltern studies. So the inferiority of certain human beings is only evident because of the cycle of superiorism, because the cycle of superiorism created a reality in which inferiority can be pseudo-observed as if it were self-evident. So we must thus conclude that the superiorist philosophy does not exist because certain human beings are factually superior to the philosophical endeavors of any other human being. Something being a historical fact only indicates that this something was a possible reality, and it became a factual reality. This by no means implies that this possible reality necessarily had to become a factual reality. There's no reason to believe that human beings were necessitated into making superiorism a factual reality. Superiorism is not inevitable. It is not a necessitated destiny or a conditio humana. Even though many philosophers have, in fact, attempted to tell the story of philosophy like this, the exact opposite is the case. Superiorism exists simply because it's possible, because certain human beings made this possibility a reality, a factual reality, through their will and through their actions, and because certain human beings continue to do so, whether they are conscious of this or not. The factual reality of superiorism is a phenomenon not necessarily connected with philosophy and not necessarily connected with the nature of human being. Certain human beings were violently excluded from the human endeavor of philosophy because of nothing other than the will and the actions of certain philosophers, because of nothing other than certain philosophers violently willing them out of the human endeavor of philosophy. Superiorism is indeed necessarily violent. Violence is to be understood as the activity that breaks or wants to break the formation of will and or the practice of will. The violence that can be found here has yet to be determined more precisely. There's still a lot that seems rather incomprehensible, but we have to ask the question, what are the consequences of this violence? What is the damage that this violence has done and continues to do to those human beings who superhumanize themselves and to those who suffer subhumanization? And of course, there's a great body of research, especially concerning the damaging effect that this philosophy has had and continues to have on philosophers racialized as Black. But it seems that we do not have an answer to the overarching question, what happens to philosophy itself when it is historically and ideologically rooted in violence? Can we philosophize non-violently at all when we are situated within the Western historical canon? So again, this is a question that is more directed to my colleagues working within Western philosophy from Western spaces. And furthermore, we need to understand what motivated this violence. What motivated a person to engage in racial superiorist violence, be it as explicit advocate or as a silent accomplice. Whatever has motivated the hearts and minds of superiorist philosophers, their wills and actions were not and were never motivated by philosophical arguments. Still, their thoughts had and have massive impact on philosophy and philosophers. Certain human beings considered their opinions to be more relevant than those of other human beings. And that has never happened for philosophical reasons, but only out of an interest that never can be justified philosophically. And that has, of course, a very unsettling implication. The exclusion of certain human beings was an act of arbitrary violence. This violence is indeed necessarily arbitrary. It only depends on whether the consequence suits the violator or not. So, superiorist violence was one of the shaping factors of Western philosophy as we know it today. Certain human beings were excluded because they were not like other human beings because, for example, they lacked whiteness. We urgently have to reevaluate our understanding of the history of philosophy as a history of arbitrary, exclusionary, will-breaking violence. The rhetoric of Western philosophy, intentionally or not, produces an understanding that this philosophy is inviting and addressing all human beings. However, this is, for many philosophers, simply not the case. So we need to find out why the superiorists of the Western historical canon speak outside of their explicitly superiorist remarks, overall in an inclusivist language. Despite their claims, Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas, Hume, Rousseau, they do not speak to all of us. They only speak to a very particular philosophical elite as a philosophical elite. They speak only to those who are sufficiently like themselves, and that means to those who do not lack, for example, whiteness, but also other things like maleness, heterosexualness, or being not a poor person or not a servant, and so on and so on. Hume, Voltaire, Rousseau, they do not speak to the human being. The spirit of the human, or the final reason of rationality, as Kant and Fichte call it, are not inclusive terms. They are radically exclusivist. Based on what has been established so far, it is hardly surprising that the simultaneity of inclusion and exclusion has not been perceived as a cognitive dissonance by the superiorist philosophers and most of their readers. The activity, to use the words of Leon Festinger, oriented towards dissonance reduction is precisely this: the division of human beings into the relevant ones and to the irrelevant others. And this consonance creating practice has, by all appearances, endured for thousands of years. From the very early days of Western philosophy until today, philosophers in the West have violently excluded the other. This is so present that it again can be identified as one of its defining conditions. It's one of its driving forces. The disturbing force of exclusion has rarely, if at all, been criticized amongst those who became canonical within the Western philosophy. Anti-philosophical superiorist violence has rarely, if at all, been acknowledged as a problem. The Aristotelian idea of friendship or the Kantian idea of peace have rarely been questioned regarding their radical, arbitrary, exclusionist, and violent superiorism. So superiorism is thus still, and the consequent violence is thus still very often to be understood to be a problem for those who are affected by it, and thus to be only a problem for very specific branches of philosophy, for instance, the problem of African philosophy. But it is not understood as a problem for all philosophers, but only for those who have developed a special, as it is sometimes called, sensitivity to such problems. Again, for example, the suppression of African philosophers is very often, by my dear Western colleagues, made to be a problem for African philosophers. And they do not understand that it is not the African philosopher who produces that problem, but those who suppress them. And that's usually the white or the Western or the global Northern philosophy. The absurdity of this brazen shifting of the problem is, of course, obvious. It is up to those who suffer from violence to find a way to come to peace with it. This audacity has shifted the burden of proof. The problem of superior violence is suddenly a problem for African human beings and a natural fact for white human beings. It is a problem for those who are unable and or unwilling to accept reality as it is, and a mere natural fact for those who simply find to be on the superior side of human beings. The capable human beings I'm sorry, a mere natural fact of those who find themselves on the superior side of the human beings. So let us emphasize again, the rejection of non-white philosophy precedes any philosophical argumentation. It is necessarily not a philosophical argument, but it is a merely anti-philosophical undertaking. It is an unacknowledged premise of many philosophical ideas of the West. The exclusion of African philosophers was never about philosophy. It was never about African human beings being philosophers. It was always about these human beings not being enough like Western philosophers. And this practice of exclusion, of course, has not yet come to an end. This is still a factual reality. And the reason for that is shockingly simple. If we still find the exclusion of non-white human beings in philosophy, then this is due to the fact that some philosophers either continue to refuse to give up the convictions of superiorism, or that the convictions of superiorism is still not understood as a conviction, but as a reality. So the exclusion of any non-white philosophers is philosophically unjustifiable. It's anti-philosophical exclusionary practice, and it's detrimental to philosophy in itself. Philosophizing from a superiorist standpoint means conducting philosophy under unreal conditions, as if in a laboratory where everything that is not to the superiorist wishes has been artificially eliminated. And this brings us to a set of important questions to which, as it seems to us, there is so far no answer. So what human being is actually speaking here when philosophy is conducted superioristically? Who is this autonomously superhumanized human being? That seems to, in my opinion, just to be an invention. But what kind of ontological status does that invention have? And to whom is this human being speaking? And who is this heteronomously subhumanized other? About what is the superiorist speaking, and with what relevance? The factual reality of human beings being subhumanized, these laboratory conditions mean nothing other than life under violence. The superiorist threats of the Western philosophy have to be understood. We need to repeat this as fundamentally violent undertaking, at least since the 18th century. Superiorist philosophy exists because certain philosophers were and are willing to exert violence, be it institutional violence or unintentional violence or whatever else. Superiorism comes from and ends in violence. But what is to be done? The exclusion of certain human beings from the history of philosophy not only violates these human beings, but also massively harms philosophy in itself. The self-aggrandizing philosophers who exclude certain philosophers violently marginalize a highly diverse part of humanity, which is only defined by being not like they are, by lacking, for instance, whiteness. Philosophers, knowingly or unknowingly, following in the steps of this superiorist domination of violence, are doomed, or more precisely, they doom themselves, to pass on to the next generations an anti-philosophical epistemicidal elitism, an elitism that rejects philosophical thoughts because of the otherness of those human beings who thought those very thoughts. It will pass on the practice of simply positing irrelevancy of thought of particular human beings, because these human beings are not, in the understanding of the superiorists, like human beings have to be, without ever providing any proof for the relevancy of this criterion. Often the problem of superiorism is made to look like a problem of those who have suffered, who are suffering from it, when it is in fact a problem produced by those who perpetrated the violence. It's certainly necessary that the inclusive reappropriation of philosophy for marginalized philosophers is supervised by those marginalized philosophers. However, a change of mind has to occur on the side of the perpetrator of the violence. And this work has not been done. In fact, as it seems, it is not even properly started. Racist superiorism is and continues to be one of the most impactful and most destructive forms of superiorism in academic philosophy. Racist philosophers have dehumanized philosophy on the one hand by dehumanizing non-white philosophers, and on the other hand, superiorist philosophers have dehumanized philosophy by superhumanizing themselves. A desuperhumanization of non-white people by white philosophers, a moral revolution that understands racist superiorism as anti-philosophical violence, has not really occurred. Of course, to overcome this problem, two components are relevant. It will be relevant that those who have suffered from violence need to recover from that violence, which I like to call adseridation. But that's not really the point I want to finish my remarks on. Of course, it is of highest importance that those who suffered from violence recover. But it is even more important that those who committed the violence will understand themselves as perpetrators of violence and will find a way to gain the trust of the rest of the world that they will not do so again. Tragically, to overcome superiorism, all the explicit advocates and the silent accomplices need to rehumanize themselves. They, however, need to rehumanize themselves after having superhumanized themselves. They do not need to recover from violence that has been that they have suffered from. They need to recover from having become violent perpetrators. So superiorist philosophers need to desuperiorize themselves. Superiorist violence must not only be overcome by those who suffered from it, but also and especially by those who committed it. Superiorists have to delegitimize themselves, or rather understand that they have never been legitimized in order to overcome their self-aggrandizing self-determination as superhuman beings. If this desuperiorization does not take place, there is good reason to fear that in the logical second in which the counterforce of those who were pushed aside, for whatever reason, are no longer able to continue to push back superiorist violence, the superiorist human beings will mercilessly steal again what they have never owned and what was rightfully taken away from them for a brief moment of justice. We have proposed, or I have proposed, to understand superiorism as the incapability to, or the unwillingness to understand and to take the other as the other seriously. So desuperiorization is now accordingly to be understood as a philosophical practice that allows us, or even necessitates us, to develop the capability and willingness to accept otherness sui generis, to become capable, able, and willing to take the other as the other seriously. So desuperiorization is to consciously, intentionally, and practically unwant one's own alleged superiority. So again, this is me talking to myself and or to my Western colleagues. We would like to, or I would like to conclude my contributions with an explanation, rather abstract, so far, of what is meant by desuperiorization in a practical sense. To desuperiorize philosophical thought in the context of what I was talking about today would mean practically A, to investigate whether a thought, an idea, a philosophy commits the superhuman fallacy. So we would need to find out whether a philosophical thought, for instance, the Aristotelian idea of friendship or Augustine's idea of free will, and so on, in whatever form implies that there's a normatively relevant difference between human beings. Should this be the case, then we have good reason to believe that we have found a superiorist thought. And now we would need to investigate whether this thought is necessarily depending on the superhuman fallacy or not. So we would need to find out whether the thought in question can only be thought when the superhuman fallacy is committed, or whether it is possible to replace the ideas of superhumanity and subhumanity with the idea of humanity in a most serious and sincere sense. And subsequently, we would need to do C, that is to investigate what happens to this thought when humanity replaces the idea of superhumanity and subhumanity. In other words, we need to find out in what sense a thought makes after we have removed the fallacy. Is there anything left of the initial thought, or is this substantially superiorist? Do we have to give up on this thought because it has vanished with the superhuman fallacy, or can we continue the tradition of this thought after desuperiorization? Of course, it's important to note that desuperiorization does not aim for a destruction of the Western philosophical canon, but to neutralize its superiorism. And it is yet to be determined what will be left. Maybe nothing, maybe something. I would argue we cannot know this now. We, and again, this we includes anyone who feels addressed, do, however, know that we cannot ever make the claim to philosophize properly should we lack the courage to face the bitter reality that my Western philosophical heritage, as I find it today, might be rooted in superiorism. Perhaps we can save all philosophical thought. I would find that quite surprising, but as long as we are not sure about that, as long as we have not philosophically investigated and desuperiorized the superiorist philosophical traditions, we cannot know whether or whether their superiorism still affect us or not. And thus, I, as a philosopher in the footsteps of the Western canon before me, cannot know whether I am whether I'm continuing to commit acts of violence or not. And I would not dare to live with this uncertainty. So, in my final remark, philosophy as we find it today is to a significant degree the result of violence. That's about the philosophy I talked about today, which is mainly the Western canon. So we find ideas relevant to be relevant, not primarily or solely because they are philosophically sound. The will to and the execution of violence significantly contributed to making them relevant, while silencing any philosophical challenges to these very ideas. Western philosophy, as we find it today, is not the result of all human beings philosophizing together, but rather a self-aggrandized elite violently dominating the human endeavor of philosophy. And those who suffered this violence have understood what is to be done. Not enough of those who have committed and continue to commit this violence have understood their part. But in my understanding, there are no more excuses. It is time. We, and again, this we includes anyone who feels addressed, need to desuperiorize ourselves, make philosophy finally an endeavor of all humankind, which is the ultimate idea of what superhuman studies try to achieve. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you very much, Bjorn, for your very interesting talk. It was very, very incisive, and I'm sure some of us have questions that we want to ask. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hands up, and I will call on you to ask your question.
Of course, it's if there are no questions. There. I think there's a question in there. Oh, there's a big question
in the chat, in the chat box. It's quite long. So Karasi is asking,
yeah.
thank you for your. Can you hear me, Bjorn?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, so Karasi is asking, thank you for your presentation. What might be the consequences for subaltern studies of a change of method in the way we look at the violence of racism? For example, we take into account current research in the field of clinical psychopathology, research on schizophrenia, narcissistic perverts, etc. Can we still define superiority tendencies as synonymous with domination, or should we see them as the manifestation of a pathology of the subject, that is, of disjunction with the principle of reality? If so, who is a true subject of domination? Is it the racialized subject, or is it the presumed superior subject? And what does this mean for your central argument? Superior equals domination. Finally, what does it mean logically to desuperiorize oneself in this case? All right, so that's a loaded question. Over to you, Bjorn.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good set of questions. I don't know if I can answer that satisfactorily, but I will try. So, what might be the consequences of subaltern studies for a change of method in the way we look at racism? For example, if we don't. Yeah, I am. That's a very interesting way to put it. When you say, should we see them as manifestations of the pathology of the subject? I used that term, a pathological, when I defined superiorism. Your remark is another pointer. It was already in brackets, but your remark is another reason to give that up, because by phrasing it as pathological, Yeah, of course, it becomes the attire of being a pathology, of being something that happens to an unfortunate individual, to an unfortunate human being who then suffers from something. But I think learning from your remark now, it seems to present the problem in a way as if this were something that happens to someone without their fault. And I'm quite drastically of a different opinion. I do not think that superiorism is something that just happens to you. Superiorism might be something that someone teaches you, and it might be something that that you grew up in, but it is something that you can overcome, and it is your responsibility to overcome it. And of course, if it is phrased too much as a pathology, the danger is there that it is then to be understood as something that somebody sort of suffers from that disease, but you do not suffer from the disease of superiorism. You make superiorism as a tool for you to dominate. And if you choose to get rid of that tool to dominate, you have to do so, and usually you have everything that you need to do so. So I will give that up to call it pathologically problem. I meant it more in the sense it's such a drastic problem. Who does that produces let me say it like this, it's a massive intellectual, philosophical, and humane problem, and you shouldn't have it. So I'm not sure if that was in the direction of where you wanted to go. This is how I understood it. But I want to try to quickly continue to go through the other points that you brought up. So you say, if so, who's the true subject of domination? Is it the racialized subject? So who is the true subject of domination? That of course implies a big problem, because the true subject of domination is, on the one hand, it's very easy to answer, it's those who are being dominated. But those who are being dominated are usually not understood as what they really are. Because if they were understood as what they really are, they were, for example, to be understood as fellow human beings. But you can't do that because as the German Enlightenment, for example, has beautifully shown, well, you should not suppress, you should not enslave your fellow human being. So what usually happens is that a particular type of humankind or of animal, or however you want to call it, has to be invented that allows you to suppress those. So when you ask for the true subject of suppression, we're asking a complicated question, in the sense that true subject is, on the one hand, obviously the human being that is suppressed, but on the other hand, that human being that is suppressed because it has a particular type of human being has been invented previously to allow the suppressor to suppress. We have only quite rare cases where the suppressors say, well, I hate human beings, and if I can do so, I will suppress them as much as I can. Usually we find many different versions of, a lot of them very infantile, anti-philosophical, and embarrassingly superficial, of stories that are being invented to defend why you are doing this, because it is not another human being. It is a human being that needs leadership, or all these kind of weird colonial ideas that have been produced. So that's a pretty difficult problem. I would say the subject of the suppression is a fellow human being, but it is the fellow human being that has been that is disregarded into a degree that you can live with yourself doing that, as even though you try to present yourselves as if you would not do that. In the Kantian philosophy, we find many foundational ethical statements which are in radical disagreement with the quotes that I've presented today. And still Kant did not seem to suffer from this kind of tension. And the answer to why did he not suffer from this kind of tension is pretty obvious, I think, because he simply invented a type of human being or a type of animal that he then felt entitled to dominate, or that he felt entitled to be not necessitated to protest that domination. So that's a very good question, even though it's at the moment quite complicated. And I'm not really sure if at the moment I can really Answer it. And who's the presumed superior subject? The superior subject is an invention by those who superhumanize themselves. Some, I'm sorry to say it, some completely intellectually rogue people who at some point thought they are better than other people. And because they had absolutely no reason to think so, they basically invented a story of why they are entitled to think so. So they looked basically at themselves and said, whoever is like me, sufficiently like me, is part of those who are superior, and whoever is not, is not. And the only reason why they were able to make this a reality is because they were willing to commit acts of violence. They were, nothing else made the alleged superhuman being superhuman other than the willingness to put their boot into the face of the next human being. So the alleged or the presumed superior human being has indeed to be called presumed superior subject, because there is no superior subject. It doesn't exist. It is the invention of maniacally narcissistic, crazy people who at some point began to understand that the world holds a lot that they want to have. And they couldn't find a way to get it that was appropriate. So they invented a crazy story about why they are entitled to have it. And that crazy story did nothing but to allow them to be violent, because the whole story of philosophy and its disregard for other people is not the fight of philosophers fighting with philosophical arguments. It's a story of suppression, of disregard, and not only towards non-white people, but as I said, if you look into the history of look in most histories of Western philosophy, and you will immediately see that there are hardly any women. That's not because there are no women philosophers, but they're systematically suppressed. So, and then you said, what does it mean to desuperiorize oneself? I'm of course still working on that, but I think desuperiorizing yourself, is in the beginning at least to go through these 3 steps that I presented there in the beginning. You need to have an understanding if any of the thoughts that you are using, be it that you develop them yourself, or that you have them from somewhere else, do they imply the necessity to make a difference, a normative difference between you and someone else? Have you ever in your life?
Okay, man.
Yeah, I got a bit into it. Oh, it's already so late. I'm sorry.
All right, Umezurike, can I ask that you mute your mic?
Oh, that's what it is. I thought you were.
Can I ask that you? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you can go on beyond just an interruption.
I'm sorry. What did you say?
I said you can go on if you wanted to say more.
Okay. Yeah. The desuperiorizing. I think that's. I mean, that's really dear to me, because I really feel that most of my Western colleagues are still very, very reluctant to do so. But I really feel that we in the West, that we is me and my Western colleagues and whoever feels that they're part of that. But of course, it's a term, or that pronoun has to be used very carefully here. But what I feel by saying it very personally is we have to be very, very careful with the philosophical heritage that we have, because that philosophical heritage is the same heritage that made colonialism, suppression, slavery, the disregard of women, the ignorance towards disabled people, towards old people, towards poor people. All these people have been marginalized. We have to understand that the history of philosophy is, to a large degree, the history of an ultra small elite. And the question is, what do these people have to say of relevance to all of us? Maybe a lot of stuff, maybe not. I really don't know. But this is why I think that this project of superaltern or superhuman studies is very important, because we need to figure out what is going on with the fact that there was a relatively small fraction, actually the minority, of philosophers who at some point felt authorized to tell the world how the world works and what's relevant and what's not relevant, and even had the audacity to tell certain people, you are part of the superhuman club. For example, you are allowed to participate in the Enlightenment, and who basically told the rest of the world, well, you go out and make our food and make our cars and make the things and all our amenities. And it is just, it boggles the mind if you think about that, because the Western philosophy, as you all unfortunately know, still considers itself to be the inventor of human rights and the inventor of gender equality and all these things. But if you look around, we have quite a poor track record, at least compared to what we claim to do. So I think when you ask what does it mean to desuperiorize yourself, I think it's on the one hand an academic task, but on the other hand, I think it's a very intimate personal task that you have to ask yourself, am I not relying on ideas that privilege myself without any reason? Do I make my voice louder than it should be? Do I use privileges, institutions that enhance my voice and make it just louder? And should I tone it down? Am I sitting on the shoulders of slaveholders, of suppressors, of anti-female thinkers? And if I do so, I got to make the very personal choice to either admit that or to stop doing that.
All right, thank you very much, Bjorn. Quickly, I think I saw Professor Majid's hands up. I don't know if he's still here or if he still wants to ask his question. I don't see him. Okay, I think he has left. All right, so is there any other question for Bjorn? All right, if there are no other questions, we're already out of time by 5 minutes. So I'll just thank you very much, Bjorn, for agreeing to do this, for giving us a very nice talk. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And Bjorn has left his email on the chat box, so feel free to contact him via email. And I think you are also on Slack, so I'm sure you can also answer some questions that may come up there too. So yeah, thank you very much, Bjorn.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye. All right, so our next speaker will be speaking at 2:15 South African Standard Time, which is about 10 minutes from now. So just sit tight, and then we'll have Joylene Guara speak to us on African feminism and womanism. All right, thank you very much for still being here. So now we have a final lecture for today for this summer school. And this lecture will be given by Dr. Joylene Guara. Dr. Joylene is a lecturer at the University of Zimbabwe in Zimbabwe. And of course, her interests in African philosophy, especially or particularly in African feminist thoughts and African womanist thoughts. And she will be speaking to us on the topic African feminism and womanism. Without much further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Joylene to give us her lecture.
Thank you very much, Arabia and Tim, for having me here. So today I'll be speaking on African feminism or womanism. Okay, so but before I get into African feminism or womanism, first of all, I need to put us into perspective. We'd have to discuss first the historical background to the rise of African feminism or womanism. So in other words, we're going to start off by looking at the different feminist movements that were there before the rise of African feminism. So for my working definition, I'm going to use to define feminism as a collection of political movements, social movements, and ideologies that defend the political, economic, the personal, and the social rights of women. It is important to note that there are several definitions of feminism, but I've chosen this to be my working definition. Okay, so generally, feminist movements, all of them, they aim at achieving and establishing equality between women and men. So they do this, they act, they speak, they write, and they advocate on behalf of women's issues and rights, and identify injustice to females in the social status quo. So, yeah, its aim is to end men's historical supremacy over women. And now, the history of feminism or of feminist movements can then be divided into three waves. The first wave, which started around 1830 to early 1900s, looked at women's fight for equal contract and property rights. So just after the French Revolution in 1789, men were accorded with constitutional rights, but women were excluded. So the first wave saw the fight for the right for women to vote, right for them to own land, the right to education, and the right to employment. So their main agenda expanded to issues that concern sexual, reproductive, and economic matters. Now, with the first wave, the seed was already planted that women had the potential to contribute just as much, if not more, than men can actually do. Now, originally, feminism focused on, the first wave focused on the promotion of equal contract and property rights for women, in the opposition to chattel marriage, ownership of married women and their children by their husbands. So this is the status quo during the first wave, and this is what the feminists in the first wave were fighting against. And then towards the end of the 19th century, we see activism focusing primarily on gaining political power, particularly the right of women's suffrage. Now, the second wave, which started around the 1960s to the 1980s, it can be understood as just broadening the debate which has been laid down by the first wave feminists. And their objective was to fight for sexual freedom. In other words, we're talking of reproductive rights and the right to abortion. We're talking of legalizing and ensuring rights to LGBT communities, and then equality in order to overcome gender-based discrimination. We see the empowerment of women, integration of women into the workforce, and then equal funding to women from the banks, right? Now, during this second wave, we see also many women were part of different movements. For instance, the Black Civil Rights Movement, Anti-Vietnam Movement, Asian American Civil Rights Movement, gay and lesbian movements, and many other groups which were fighting for equality, or as it were. But then most of these women who were in these groups felt that their voices were not being heard. And they felt that in order for them to gain respect and to be heard, they first needed to address gender equality concerns. So in other words, in as much as they were in different movements, but still their voices could not be heard until they deal with issues of gender equality. So whilst the first wave focused on rights such as suffrage, the second wave was concerned with other issues of equality, such as ending discrimination. Now, the first wave advocated for suffrage rights, but then this did not bring equality did not bring equality as it were. Now, the second wave feminists represented were on the representation of the female body, and the meanings that are attached to it and the biological differences between the female body and the male body. We see this in the works of Simone de Beauvoir, her works, The Second Sex, which has major two premises. And the first premise is that first, men as the essential being or subject treated women as an unessential being or object. And secondly, much of women's psychological self is socially constructed with very few physiological rooted feminine qualities or values. And then the major works during this wave, which is the second wave, focused on how cultural and social marginalization of women has been occurring throughout history. It also focused on enormous social change, making the existing social structures absurd to their inherent patriarchy. Now, how the social change would take place is a bone of contention, and so it divided the feminists into Marxists, liberal, and radical feminists. Now, we move on to the third wave, which took place around the 1990s to the early 2000s. Now, the third wave identifies its limitations, such as the fact that it remained too white and middle-class oriented, and that it made ordinary women feel guilty for enjoying self-expression. They also believe that the conditions of the second wave feminism no longer exist, so it does not resonate with today's women. So this wave focuses on queer and non-white women. It believes that all ideas and concepts are socially constructed, including masculinism, and that everyone should be treated equally. So it also advocated for changes on stereotypes, media portrayals, and language used to define women. For instance, there was the call to reclaim derogatory terms such as bitch, spinster, slut, and so on. Bitch was reclaimed in the 1999 book, Beach, In Praise of Difficult Women by Elizabeth Watson. The diversity of women is recognized and emphasis is placed on identity, gender, race, nation, social order, and sexual preference. Now, the third wave seeks to challenge or avoid what it deems the second wave's essentialist definitions of femininity, which, according to them, overemphasized the experiences of upper middle class white women. So from the discussion, we can see that the pioneers of feminism were white middle class women of privilege who were not so concerned about women of color, poor women, or women with disabilities. Now, Black women struggled to identify with traditional feminism because they did not identify with issues that feminism typically advocated or was advocating for. Now, this prompted the rise of Black feminism. So as part of my introduction, I'm going to look at briefly these movements that led to the rise of African feminism as well. Now, a point to note before we even get into Black feminism is that it has been accused by scholars as adopting the feminist ideology into the African context. So in other words, they argued that there's nothing new really in Black feminism. They are just importing Western ideologies into the African context, as it were. Now, the question that I pose is, are there significant differences between the objectives of African or Black feminism and those of traditional feminism? I'll also go on to look at the other movements that arose, such as womanism, Africana womanism, and the African feminism from continental African women. So now, my question, in line with the accusation that has been leveled against Black feminism, I would further ask, did Black feminism accept uncritically the tenets of traditional feminism? So as we go, we need to take note of some of these questions. I'll be addressing them as we progress. So yeah, apart from Black feminism, we see also the rise of womanism, which emerged in support of Black feminism, but though it had a different agenda from that of feminism itself. Now, womanism claims to be concerned about the redemption of all Black women globally, which may be seen as a difference from Black feminism, which had not crossed the European or American borders. So womanism appreciates the different cultures and histories of various Black women as it advocates the end of oppression. And then from the African American side, the final theory that has been proposed to champion Black women's rights as Africana womanism. And it also purports to be different from both Black feminism and womanism, and is grounded in African culture and focuses on unique experiences, struggles, needs, and desires of Africana women. So now the question is, are there really differences between or amongst these theories that have been propounded is trying to champion for equality for women? Okay. So now Black feminism. Now I'll go on to discuss the characteristics and the traits of Black feminism, and then I'll move on to womanism as it was proposed in African American by African American women, and then move on to African feminism as advanced by African continental continental African women. Now, so Black feminism is a feminist movement that was pioneered by African American women, who demanded justice for women who have been marginalized and oppressed. So its main issues are on race, class oppression, as well as gender issues in the Black community. Now, the struggles of women of color are different from white women who are more privileged. So that fact alone led to the rise of Black feminism. They could not identify with the struggles of the white feminists. And also, Black feminists noted that some of the prominent white feminists were racist. For instance, in the writings of Elizabeth Stanton, we find that she challenged the status quo of white women being denied the right to vote, whereas, and I quote, the degraded Black men had that right. So already this sets the mood of racial overtones, which Black feminists could not identify with. And also Frances Willard described Black men as drunken menaces who were collectively guilty of raping white women. So Black feminists would not identify with this because there were racial overtones in white feminism. So they find it difficult. Those who argue for equal rights find it difficult to identify themselves as feminists. Now, so Black feminism would also stand as a resistance to Western domination, as for almost 200 years in the United States, Black women suffered extreme and unimaginable cruelty under legalized system of human slavery. It was also a response to these social, economic, and political inequalities, as Black women were not recognized as citizens and they possessed no legal rights and did not enjoy any protection of the law. So together with their men, they suffered. They were assaulted physically, emotionally, psychologically, and sexually. And then slavery was their permanent status for a very long time. So the very first Black women to add their voices were abolitionists who advocated the end of slavery and the end of slave trade. So they believed that it was nonsensical to advocate social empowerment through gender struggle without first uprooting the evil of slavery. Now, these Black women of the 18th century fought fiercely against slavery, and it was not difficult for the Black feminists of the 19th century to demand their liberation and the liberation of the entire race. So it's no longer about, unlike in feminism where they are fighting for gender equality, the Black feminists are also struggling with racial as well as sexism. Now, so in order for the Black feminists to argue for the liberation of Black people, it meant challenging racism and sexism, which was experienced by Black women. Now, lamenting the suffering of Black women as opposed to white women and Black men, Sojourn Truth asked the famous question, "Ain't I a woman?" Now, Truth states that Black women had different experiences from that of white women. Like white women were fighting to have voting and labor rights, whereas Black women were struggling to be recognized as people. Now, the main aim now of Black feminism was to end racial or both racial and class discrimination so that the Black women could be seen as equal to every other race, as it were. Now, there are certain themes that run across Black feminism. The first one is intersectionality, which is an important aspect of Black feminism, which is the view that the issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality depend on each other as they cannot be separated. So whenever you're fighting for gender equality, you also have to take into consideration issues of race, issues of class, and issues of sexuality. So in other words, a Black woman does not fight one struggle. So hers is an intertwined struggle, including various issues. This alone separates Black feminism from white-dominated feminist movement. I think I will take you back to the question of, or the charge that was leveled against Black feminism, that it's just an appendage of Black to feminism. So these are the notable differences between Black feminism and white-dominated feminist movements. Now, secondly, Black feminism tried to dislodge racial and class domination as well as gender oppression. Now, as they try to address gender inequality issues as experienced within the Black community. So the issues that are at play here are racial and class domination as well as gender oppression, unlike in the white feminist movement. And you also notice that when Black feminism arose, women's contributions to society were initially not recognized, and leadership roles were reserved only for Black men. So only Black men's activities were initially given recognition. The contribution of Black women was ignored. Then thirdly, they say that the feminist movement is helping them in addressing and challenging patriarchy. And another point of departure is that Black feminists do not attack individual Black men. They actually want to work with them to expand and fight against inequality and injustice for women. And it does not seek to divide the Black race along exclusivist gendered lines, as it desires emancipation in all spheres of life, unlike maybe if you compare it with liberal feminism, which was anti-male. Lastly, Black feminists present a history and culture which enables them to resist and transform daily discrimination. So Black feminism evolved not only for resistance to white feminism, but also from Black women's quest to empower themselves according to their unique experiences. And in support of Black feminism, there is womanism, which was popularized by Alice Walker. So Alice Walker, in an essay, In Search of Our Mother's Garden, argues that a womanist is a Black feminist or a feminist of color. So these are, for her, these are Black women who strive for self-determination. And for her, it is very difficult to separate womanism from Black feminism. For the agenda is the same, that is attaining liberty and equality with every other race, as well as fighting for recognition in social, political, and economic spheres. Like I said, now it is difficult, and even to her own admission, or Walker's own admission, to differentiate this movement from Black feminism, since it takes it as its foundation. Now, the major tenets of womanism as presented by Walker do not deviate from the main focus of Black feminism. And some scholars would view womanism as part and parcel of Black feminism, and some adherents of womanism are also advocates of Black feminism. Now, Walker equates womanism with Black feminism. And as she defines a womanist as a Black woman who is superior to a white woman. And this is clearly stated in one of her famous statements, and I quote, "Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender." This simply suggests that feminism is a component beneath the much larger ideological umbrella of womanism. And in her definition, she also brings out the idea that womanists are universalists. So she clearly shows how similar womanism is to Black feminism, as it were. And in this definition, she also states that womanism is committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, that is both male and female. So in other words, there's harmonious relationship between Black men and women, unlike in radical feminism. Also, maybe where Walker differs from Black feminism is where she defines a womanist as a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually. Now, the fact that womanism allowed women to prefer sexual relations with other women makes it consistent with white feminism, but not with Black feminism, rather. So probably would say this is just an addition, since she identifies herself as a Black feminist, to say probably in a womanism, she added the fact that we can have lesbianism in Black feminism. However, this is how far it goes when it comes to similarities between feminism and womanism, that the allowance of sexual relations between women. However, it does not despise heterosexual relations. And also, womanism is not hostile towards men. For Walker argues that a womanist also loves individual men sexually or non-sexually, right? So in this regard, womanism seemingly supplies a way for Black women to address gender oppression without really attacking their male counterparts. Also, in a definition, she talks about the relationship of women in terms of the relationship that exists between a mother and a daughter. So this also indicates that, unlike white feminism, womanism values motherhood to be essential to womanhood. And then another more recent African-American alternative concept to feminism is that the one that was propounded by Cleonora Hudson Wilms, which is Africana womanism. So like Walker's womanism, Africana womanism is created and designed for all Black women. And also, yeah, we then find out that Africana womanism arose as a way of dealing with some of the challenges that were faced by womanism or Alice Walker's womanism. And she also differentiates a movement from that of Black feminism and also from that of Alice Walker's womanism, as it were. So in terms of the term womanism, propounded by Alice Walker, but at the same time, during the time that Ogunyemi was writing, she also arrived at the term independent of Walker. And then when she started her own movement, she termed it humanism, but later on called it African humanism. So this one arose as a way of, well, after realizing that these African American movements did not cater for the continental African women, as it were. So they were only concerned about their plight or their experiences to the exclusion of the continental African woman. Now, Ogunyeme's conceptions of African womanism, they seem to resonate well with Walker and Hudson Williams' visions of humanism, but still there are decisive differences. Now, first of all, or the most substantial difference is that Ogunyeme wishes to conceptualize an ideology that clearly demarcates and emancipates African womanism from both white feminism, African American womanism, or feminism, as it were. Now, I quote, since feminism and African American womanism overlook African peculiarities, there is a need to define African womanism. So Ogunyemi believes that only African women, maybe African womanists. So in other words, this is the first demarcation that she makes between Africana womanism or African American feminism and her own African womanism, as it were. So for her, it is only African women that can be African womanists. Now, she further dissociates herself from Walker as she highlights that the womanist she's advocating for does not identify with Walker's precepts. For instance, Africans are obsessed with having children, and this is, for her, this is her own departure from Walker. And it's another difference is that there's incompatible attitudes towards lesbianism. So in other words, in her theory, she does not tolerate lesbianism like what Walker did. So for Ogunyemi, African womanism rejects lesbianism love because of the African silence or intolerance of lesbianism. Now, the core of a definition of African womanism is the conviction that the gender question can be dealt with only in the context of other issues that are relevant for African women. The core of Ogunyemi's definition of African womanism is the conviction that, in this regard, she exceeds Walker's and Hudson Williams' race, class, gender approach. Now, she goes on to stress that an African womanist will recognize that along with the consciousness of sexual issues, she must incorporate racial, cultural, national, economic, and political considerations into a philosophy. Now, an African womanist must deal with, among other things, inter-ethnic skirmishes and cleansing, religious fundamentalism, the language issue, and in-lawism. So apart from Ogunyemi, there are other alternative concepts of feminism in the African continent, which include, I've just picked 4 of these because I thought this important for this discussion. So there's Stewanism, which was advocated for by Omolara Ogundipe Leslie, and this focuses on women and their concerns and the structures that oppress women and how to overcome them. So these structures, according to her, are what she termed the 6 mountains, and that is colonial oppression, oppression of tradition, on backwardness, men, hair color, and finally herself. So these are the 6 mountains that women face, which Ogundipe Leslie is trying to argue against and then propose ways to overcome them. And there's also motherism of Catherine Ocholoni. This is a maternal form of feminism which holds that rural women are performing the necessary tasks for nurturing society through childbirth as well as child upbringing. And then there's also femalism of Chioma Opara, which emphasizes the importance of African women body. The argument is that at the center of African feminism conversations is the African woman's body. And then there's nego-feminism, which was popularized by Obiama Naimeka. This one deals with culture of negotiation and compromise in order to reach an agreement to women's freedom. And then finally, there's the snail sense of Akachi Adimora Ezigbo. And this one simply argues that African women should be slow like snails when dealing with men in a patriarchal society. So it's a matter of survival strategy, like becoming a snail in order for you to achieve what you want, being patient with your male counterparts. Yes, so there may be others, but for me, like I said, these 4 are key and they develop from the African culture. And at the bottom of all these 4, they try to incorporate gender inclusion, gender collaboration, gender accommodation, such that men and women contribute to improve the condition of women. So finally, well, as my conclusion, I believe that there's an evolution of thought in the concept of feminism. African feminism arises as a reaction to mainstream feminism as well as African patriarchal society, and then whereby Black women were not included in mainstream feminism's fight for equality, which prompted for the rise of Black feminism, womanism, and Africana womanism. So, however, still these did not take into account the experiences of continental African women, which also led to the rise of motherism, stewaism, nego-feminism, and snail sense feminism, among others. So yeah, I would say this is my closing remark. So it's a difficult task for a non-feminist to talk about feminism. I thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Joylene, for your very, very interesting talk. I can see hands are up already. So if you have any questions, as usual, just raise your hands up, and if you can, Dr. Joylene will respond to your question. May I also ask that your questions are very brief because of time. So Umezurike, I would like to invite you to ask a question very, very, very briefly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Arabia. Thank you so very much. And my thank goes to the presenter too. That's very apt, insightful, and intriguing, indeed. When you talk about this this issue of feminism and gender inequalities and all that, I think I've been wondering. I'm not saying actually that women are not being somehow maltreated and you know, in some ways and all that, but like probably in the issue of saying, when we want to, if somebody, if you want to, you can call a male fellow a witch, and equally a female fellow a witch. And then one could be wondering what's happening. We have what we call wizard, for instance, but we hardly use that word wizard on a male fellow. Rather, we use witch as if maybe everything about women, you know, something bad about women and all that. So, which I don't really agree with. But then I have some issues because women, you know, women have been clamoring for this equality of a thing, which is okay. But I want to ask, this equality they are talking about, because I'm thinking it's a natural thing for somehow sort of men to be in charge in some areas of life. Like when you talk about politics, for instance, women will be talking about, you know, talk about inclusion. They inclusiveness. They want to. They should be included in this, you know, area of politics and the rest of them. It's covered that they are being given the opportunity to explore, like, you know, every other person. But at the end, it is discovered that they will probably find it difficult to thrive, like their male counterparts and all that. But that is not the issue. I want to specifically ask, like Dr. Arabia rightly said, that the person who wants to ask questions should be brief. I want to ask, Sma, is this gender inequality, is gender equality a human creation, or is it an innate thing? Is it a human creation or an innate thing? Put differently, is it occasioned, you know, to be like that beforehand, or is it a human creation? Is gender equality a human creation, or is it an innate thing? Is it the way God, is it the way it has been planned, predetermined to be, or is it a human creation? Thank you. Thank you. Hello? Hello?
Okay, Arabia, should I respond?
Hello, I hope you got my question.
Yeah, I think I got your question. I was waiting.
Is it a predeterministic thing? You know, has it been arranged to be so? Is it an innate thing, or is it a human creation? When we talk about gender inequality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Zorike, for your contribution as well as your question. I wouldn't say gender inequality is a woman creation, but I would want to believe that it is socially constructed. And I also wouldn't think that it was a human thing, as it were. We were all created equal, just like you were talking about. Is it a case of were things like that from creation? I believe we're all created equal, but through socialization, we see gender inequality, certain roles ascribed to women. And I also want to believe, even as we are raising our own children, we are guilty of the same charge. A boy child is not allowed to peep in the pots in the kitchen, and also it becomes something out of this world if you see a girl child being interested in guns and toy cars, as it were. I don't know if I have managed to answer you properly. For me, it is socially constructed.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Joylene, for your response. I think Francis's hand was up. Francis Ofwebu, you can ask your question, and then after that, I'll read Hope's questions.
Hello, thank you, Arigato. So, presenter, Dr. Joylene, thank you very much for your presentation. Just somehow a little bit personal, I don't know which of them you belong to, whether feminist or Black feminist or a womanist, African womanist, African womanist, each of the ways, I don't know. So, but do you actually justify their claims? If so, how far have they gone to solve some of their problems? I'm just trying to support you people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis, for that question. Like I said in my closing remark, it was very difficult for a non-feminist to talk about feminism. So I don't belong to neither of them, but I do believe to some extent they are justified, because if you look at our own experiences, just like the previous speaker talked about, it doesn't really necessarily mean that there are no women philosophers, but their voices are suppressed. So for the feminists to then call for equality, I think, yeah, it is, they are within their rights, as it were. Yeah, because the patriarchy society, as it were, oppresses or suppresses women's voices. Well, I don't know if I answered you well, Francis.
Well, there's no problem, since you're not one of them. No problem. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Francis. I'll now read Hope's questions. She says, that was so wonderful. Thank you. Would you please say more about the feminist issues about hair color and style that Hudson Weems discusses? Also, are there other authors we can read on Africana feminist approaches to beauty and culture, or to beauty culture?
Okay. So the question is, can I speak more on hair color?
She says, would you please say more about the feminist issues about hair color and style that Hudson Weems discusses?
Oh, okay. So hair color, I'm taking it from Leslie, isn't it? So just by being a Black woman, first, she's Black, and second, she's a woman. Already we know that Blacks were discriminated against and made slaves or something like that. So it becomes worse when she's also a woman and she is of the Black color, as it were. So I'll take it that this is coming from Leslie, as it were, one of her 6 mountains. These are some of the challenges that African women are facing. So apart from just being a woman, her own color is already puts her at a disadvantage. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Emmanuel, I can see your hand is up. You can ask your question very briefly.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering about the question of equality, and when we say man or female and male should be equal, in what instances, or what are we talking about? Are we talking about what a man can do, a woman can do? Because this is where I see many contentious issues coming from. For example, when you talk about, if we talk about soccer, for example, you cannot put women on the same pitch to play with men. And this has also come into the questions of transgender, because people say, well, there's no difference between a man and a woman. So if I change, I'm a man, and I change to be female, and then I go and participate in athletics, for example, others say I'll be on an advantage. So when we talk about equality, are we talking about equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. From my take, when they talk about equality, it's equality of opportunity. In their arguments, they're simply arguing that whatever that men or the platforms that men are enjoying should also be open to females, as it were. They need to enjoy the same rights as men. If men can vote, why can't women vote? If men can own property, why can't women own property? If men can own land or whatever it is, what makes it difficult for women to also do the same or be offered the same opportunity? Or if we put CVs together and you're looking for someone, there's certain companies who definitely shun from female applicants, because they simply highlight that because she's a woman, soon she'll be going for maternity, and probably 2 years later should also want to go for maternity, and this will counter our production or something like that. That alone is discrimination against women. This is a national service that we do not choose to, or that we should be doing. We should also be honored. So for me, it's equal opportunity. A job that a man can get, a woman should also have the opportunity to engage in that particular job. Not necessarily that they should be positioned against each other in the soccer field, like the example that you've given. Of course, biologically, men and women are different. But if soccer could be played by men, it should also be open to be played by women. I don't know if I've answered you, Emmanuel.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. Are there any other questions? I'm expecting one question from Pascal Ania. I think he's still typing. I'll read it shortly, but in the meantime, are there any other questions you want to ask?
Sorry, Arabia, sorry, I didn't get you.
Yeah, I was asking if there were any other questions that the participants want to ask. I'm expecting a question from Pascal Ania, who is still typing his question. But in the meantime, is there any other person that wants to ask the question? You can raise your hands or type it on the chat box. All right, so the question from Pascal is, from your presentation, are you saying that without Western feminism, there could have been no African feminism?
Okay, thank you, Arabia. Yeah, I would say without Western feminism, there wouldn't be African feminism, as it were. Why? Simply because African feminism arises as a reaction to Western feminism, either to correct the misconceptions of Western feminism and then also challenge patriarchy, as it were. But to say probably, maybe, but in the meantime, what set the tone for African feminism is Western feminism.
All right, thank you. I think he has another rejoinder, if I'm not mistaken. Wait for him to type that rejoinder. while waiting, I don't know if this is a question from Emmanuel. Okay, I think he was making a comment and suggesting that there are some, or maybe many, who would argue that women are, of course, are more at an advantage in African societies than men because of the issue of paying dowries, going to war, being financial, the requirement to be financially stable. That all these things are disadvantage. Things that put men at a disadvantage in some African societies. I wonder if you have any response to that comment.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you could say it's an advantage, but probably it's not really an advantage for African women that they or men pay dowry for them, because for the feminists, this is a claim to ownership. Once you pay dowry for me, then it means I'm now your property, as it were. Like in our language, we call it roora. Once you pay lobola, I become your property, and I'm there to expand your lineage, as it were. So for me, I wouldn't say it's really an advantage that men pay dowry for us, because it's also another way of expressing dominance of men over women. And then the financial aspect. I think it just also goes back to what I've highlighted earlier on, that when you say a man has to be stable financially, these are socially constructed expectations of what men should be or what women should be. So all these things that we are talking about are socially constructed, in which we can also, I remember there's a book that is also arguing against the payment of dowry for women. We can just go for free and then you enjoy your marriage. I don't know. But
all right.
social, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to add the rejoinder that Pascal was just typed now. He said, what is the clear-cut difference between African feminism and Western feminism?
Okay, so the difference between African feminism, the difference between African feminism and Western feminism is what I elaborated at the end of my presentation, that when you look at African feminism, we're talking about the coming together, or as it were, of males and females together in this fight together. But when you look at Western feminism, the male is more or less, especially if I'm to look at radical feminism, the male is an enemy of the female. And the female also is claiming rights over her body, unlike in African feminism, where the woman understands her role, as it were, that of nurturing the society, and that of childbirth, and that of upbringing that same child. So in African feminism, if I'm to take one of the trends that I looked at, we're talking about negotiation and compromise in order for us to reach an agreement. So we are bringing on board both men and women together to fight for the freedom of women.
All right. Thank you very much, Joylene, for that response. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank you, Joylene, for being our last presenter for today and for agreeing to be a part of this African philosophy summer school. It has been great having you here and listening to your presentation and your talk. On that note, I would like to again thank all the participants that were able to, attend all the lectures that we put together. It was great having you here, hearing your questions and your contributions. Special thanks to all our instructors who from the very beginning agreed to be part of the summer school, to give their talks, and respond to some of your questions and comments, both here on Zoom and on Slack and so on. We are really, really grateful. The hope is that this will be the first amongst a few other summer schools that will be organized by the CSP in the coming years on various aspects of African philosophy, perhaps much more specific aspects of philosophy, so we can go deeper into some branches of African philosophy, but we will see what happens in the coming few years and how we can organize that. Also like to especially thank the local organizing team, Amara Esther Chimakonam and Dr. Amara Esther Chimakonam and Patrick Effiong, who have worked tirelessly to make sure that this summer school is a huge success. Thank you, guys. So one last information, we will send out your certificates to your email as soon as we compile the list of actual participants, people who actually attended the summer school. Once we are done with that, we'll send you your certificate of participation and attendance. And we hope to see you more in more of our events, like in the emails I've been bombarding your emails with. You can find links to our website, to our social media handles. And of course, you can look out on your mailing lists for any announcements of any of our events, like our workshop, conferences, or roundtable discussions, or debates that we may organize in the near future. So you can look out for that. You can also take a look at our YouTube channel for more videos from this conversational school. Thank you. So I'd like to thank you all for being here. Thank you so much. We'll see you at our next CSP event.
Thank you, Dr. Arabia. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.